The Allied campaign against Japan in the Pacific Theater during World War II, like the European theater, occurred over a multitude of fronts. American submarines patrolled beneath the waves of the Pacific, striking against Japanese shipping to starve the enemy of food and supplies. B-29 bombers, which could now fly round-trip from Saipan, were destroying Japanese cities and industrial centers day after day with destruction from the air. Admiral Nimitz' island-hopping campaign moved against Japan's remote island outposts and gradually came closer to the homeland. General MacArthur's land campaign moved through the Dutch East Indies and toward the Philippines. China, which had started to endure Japanese occupation since the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, continued to be a thorn in the side of Imperial Japan due to its size, difficulty of occupation, and stubbornness of its people in resisting the occupiers. After the Doolittle raid, in which multiple raiders landed or crashed in Japanese-occupied China and were given aid and comfort by the locals, the Japanese enacted furious revenge against Chinese partisans for their willingness to support Japan's enemies. Tens of thousands of Chinese were deliberately shot by the Japanese, and other Chinese were deliberately infected with diseases, such as cholera and dysentery, by an experimental biological weapons program known as Unit 731. The program was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Chinese. Wanton executions of innocent Chinese men, women, and children were a regular occurrence. The British and Americans were determined to aid the Republic of China during its occupation and free it from its oppressors. To that end, Chinese nationalist President Chiang Kai-shek met with United States President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Cairo, Egypt in November of 1943. The Allied powers at Cairo publicly committed themselves to the continual aid of China during its occupation, expand American Lend-Lease aid to China, resolved to launch a counterattack through Burma, and demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan and the return of all occupied Chinese territories. Although not yet yielding immediate results, the Cairo Conference elevated the Republic of China to an equal status as an ally of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. American Lend-Lease aid flowed into China through the Burma Road, which extended from the port city of Rangoon up through the country until it crossed into mainland China. Realizing the value of the road to the Allies, however, the Japanese occupied Burma in 1942 and cut the road and therefore the supply chain to the Chinese. Without the continuation of supplies into China, there would be little means for the Chinese to continue their resistance against the Japanese. The only means to get support into China was by flying cargo planes from British India over the Himalayan mountains to airfields in China. This route, known as flying over the hump, could be treacherous, however, threatened by weather, and subject to attack by Japanese forces. The American general in charge of the Burmese China theater was General Joseph Stilwell. The general was nicknamed Vinegar Joe for his surly personality and caustic language. He was difficult to get along with, and he publicly criticized his British and Chinese allies. Nevertheless, Stilwell was determined to open a new road of supply to China and do whatever it took to get it accomplished. American and British planners resolved to cut a new road through the jungles of northern Burma that would connect India to China, a road that would become known as the Lido Road. The task was treacherous and logistically overwhelming over some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Thousands of Burmese, British, and Chinese laborers cut a path through the jungle and alongside steep mountains. 35,000 local workers helped to build the road, as did 15,000 American soldiers, most of whom were African Americans. Close to 1,100 Americans died during the construction of the road, and the completed road was 1,079 miles, which led to the famous quip, "One man a mile." The road had to be suitable for heavy army trucks to pass, and thus significant work had to be done to remove trees and brush, level grades, and widen paths for the trucks to pass. Once the trucks exited the Lido Road, they still had to make it through the interior mountains of China, including the famous 24 bends, in order to reach Chinese cities. The completion of the Lido Road was one of the great engineering feats of the Second World War, and alongside the cargo flights that continued to make the flight over the hump, aid continued to pour into China to help the Chinese resist their oppressors. By the end of the Second World War, China would register second only to the Soviet Union in the number of deaths. It registered at 20 million lives. Perhaps only 1/5 of these deaths were combat-related deaths, the majority being Chinese civilians who were victims of Japanese attacks and deliberately exterminated. The Imperial Japanese Army had resolved upon the three alls policy during the course of the war in China: kill all, burn all, loot all, to a devastating effect. Without question, there was immense relief when at last Japanese forces surrendered in China in 1945. While Admiral Nimitz led the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, U.S. Army forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur launched an additional theater to the west. In April of 1942, MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area. With many American troops taken up with the island campaign, MacArthur's forces would be largely composed of Australians. With an eye on fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines, MacArthur eyed a path north from Australia that would move into the conquered Dutch East Indies through the large island of New Guinea and its surrounding islands. The New Guinea campaign would be remembered as one of the most arduous efforts of the entire Second World War. The Bismarck Archipelago, including New Guinea, had originally been German colonies, but after Germany's defeat in World War I, the islands were seized by the British, and Australia was given a mandate to rule them. A prime reason for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was that Japan desired to seize the islands in the other Indies to obtain the oil and supplies they needed to continue their war effort without the U.S. Navy in the way to stop them. The Japanese did move into the archipelago in early of 1942. The Japanese established a large air and naval base at Rabaul, on the northern tip of the island of New Britain, taking advantage of its ideal natural harbor. Port Moresby served as an important forward base for the Allies and sought to use its position on Papua as a jumping-off point for further operations north against the Japanese. Thus, much of the early conflict in the New Guinea campaign took place across the main island, with the Japanese landing on the north and trying to move south, and the Allies endeavoring to hold Port Moresby and moving north. The two armies met in the thick heights of the Owen Stanley Mountains. These jungle-covered heights reached 6,000 feet and then plummeted suddenly down to the coast on each side. Fighting was fierce and conducted under nearly impossible conditions. The heat, humidity, rains, and high altitudes wore out soldiers before they even entered into combat. Jungle diseases wiped out more men than combat on both sides. The tenacity of MacArthur's troops, however, paid off, and the Allies were able to drive the Japanese out of the mountains and even from their coastal bases on the north side of the island. MacArthur decided on a unique strategy in his approach against the large air and naval base at Rabaul on New Britain. Realizing the challenge and cost that a direct assault against the base would cost his forces, he decided to bypass and isolate the base, thereby rendering it irrelevant by seizing many of the surrounding islands. Operation Cartwheel, conducted as a joint operation between MacArthur's ground troops and the U.S. Navy, included a multitude of amphibious landings and bombing raids that subdued many of the smaller Japanese garrisons surrounding Rabaul. Some of the fiercest fighting of Operation Cartwheel took place during the Battle for Cape Gloucester on the western end of the island of New Britain. The 1st Marine Division, which had earned notoriety for its success and sacrifices on Guadalcanal, landed in 2 groups on the Cape in December of 1943. After intense fighting, the Marines were able to take control of the 2 landing strips on the Cape and repurpose them for the American Army. As Operation Cartwheel gradually took more islands and their airstrips from the Japanese, the strategic significance of the base of Rabaul became more threatened and less valuable. Each airstrip on each island the Marines took could be turned against Rabaul. American bombers routinely and daily bombed the base, reducing its effectiveness. Operation Cartwheel was a great success as it confused the Japanese regarding American war plans and forced the Japanese to abandon its base at Rabaul, even though it was not directly assaulted and taken on the ground by the Allies. As the Allies bypassed and isolated it, the base at Rabaul in effect became a Japanese POW camp for the remainder of the war, and MacArthur was able to move north towards the Philippines. Operation Cartwheel was also assisted by the naval forces of the Southern Pacific Fleet under the command of Admiral William F. Halsey. Nicknamed Bull Halsey, the admiral was one of the more audacious, perhaps reckless, naval commanders of the entire Second World War. Born in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1882, Halsey came from a long line of Navy men, extending as far back as the colonial period all the way up to his own father. Halsey received a commission to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where he graduated in 1904. Halsey served his early years in the Navy aboard battleships, including being a part of President Theodore Roosevelt's famous Great White Fleet, which sailed around the world from 1907 to 1909. Halsey also served aboard torpedo boats in the 1920s and became aware of their value as part of a larger fleet. Halsey served as naval attaché to several foreign states before returning to sea in the 1930s to command destroyers. After completing a course in naval aviation at the Naval War College, Halsey was given command of the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. In 1935, at the age of 52, Halsey earned his naval aviator wings. He remains the oldest individual to do so in naval history. Halsey realized that the Navy that mastered aviation would have an enormous strategic advantage in the next war. Promoted to Rear Admiral in 1938, Halsey was given command of carrier divisions on the eve of World War II. Halsey's flagship, the USS Enterprise, was on a patrol to Wake Island when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. Enterprise arrived the next day to survey the wreckage at Pearl. Thereafter, Halsey used his carrier force to conduct hit-and-run strikes against the Japanese in the South Pacific. Struck with a bad case of psoriasis, a skin condition, Halsey did not participate in the Battle of Midway and was forced to coalesce stateside. After his recovery, however, Halsey was eager to get back into the fight. Halsey used his forces to support the Marines on Guadalcanal and secure the Lower Solomons, and then participated in Operation Cartwheel, taking control of the Northern Solomons, and supporting MacArthur's drive north. After a string of disastrous defeats in the Solomons and around New Guinea, the Japanese were determined to block the forthcoming American campaign headed towards the Philippines. The Philippines, which had been an American colony since the late 19th century, held a special relationship with the United States. General MacArthur had worked during the interwar years to build up its defense forces and prepare the colony for independence. Those forces, however, were quickly overrun in January of 1942 as the Japanese invaded shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. For the next 3 years, Filipinos lived under the brutal occupation of the Japanese and were often consigned to slave labor for the Imperial Japanese forces. Filipinos eagerly awaited the fulfillment of MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines and secure their liberation. The Allies originally planned to commence the liberation of the Philippines by invading the large southern island of Mindanao first. However, the plan was changed and it was determined to seize the smaller island of Leyte first with its valuable surrounding gulf and port facilities. In preparation for the assault, American planes dropped weapons and supplies to Filipino guerrillas in the jungles to support their resistance against the occupiers and provoke a popular Filipino revolution. On October 20th, 1944, the U.S. Sixth Army commenced landings on the eastern beaches of Leyte with the support of naval and air bombardment. Although severely decimated from previous battles, the Imperial Japanese Navy amassed most of its remaining ships to threaten the landings in the hope that it would force a massive naval engagement with the Americans, which could then turn the tide of the war to their favor. The Japanese plan to thwart the landings, wipe out the American fleet, and reverse the course of the war was to assemble a northern force which would act as bait to draw the U.S. Navy north and away from the islands. Meanwhile, two other Japanese strike groups would attack the Americans at the Leyte landings. One center force would move through the Cebuan Sea and the San Bernardino Strait to surprise the Americans on the east coast of the island of Samar. Another southern strike force would come at the Americans north of Mindanao through the Surigao Strait. The Japanese hoped the Americans would take the bait to the north so that the center and southern forces could move in undetected. The ensuing Battle of the Leyte Gulf is a perfect example of how the fog of war and the unexpected contingencies of battle can alter events and produce results completely unexpected. Many historians consider the Battle of Leyte Gulf as the largest naval battle in history, and certainly of the Second World War. Hundreds of ships were part of the battle, and over 200,000 sailors participated. American submarines spotted the central and southern strike forces moving through the islands towards Leyte far earlier than the Japanese had anticipated, and commenced engaging them. It seemed that the Japanese plan had already failed before commencing, and that the northern force acting as bait would be irrelevant. However, Admiral Halsey took the bait and moved his Third Fleet north, seeking to destroy the Japanese carrier force. Halsey did not know that the battles of Coral Sea and Midway had already depleted the Japanese carrier forces and its aviators. The Japanese carriers in the Northern Strike Force were impotent shells which only held a little over 100 aircraft combined. Nevertheless, Halsey took the bait and moved north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Halsey had assumed the earlier engagement of the Japanese center force with American pilots and submarines would mean the Japanese would retreat back through the strait. Instead, the center force regrouped and continued through the strait and suddenly appeared off the coast of Samar, a growing and grave threat to the landing Americans at Leyte. Meanwhile, the Japanese southern force was moving quickly towards the Leyte landings as well. To do so, they would need to quickly run through the narrow Surigao Strait to get into Leyte Gulf and attack the Americans. Ships from the American 7th Fleet saw the danger and quickly responded by entering the Surigao Strait itself from the north. The battle that took place in the Surigao Strait would be the last battleship-to-battleship conflict in history and witness, for the most recent time in history, the most notable naval maneuver in famous sea battles. The Japanese Southern Force knew the run through the strait would be harrowing, but decided to take the risk anyway. They sailed into a deadly trap that featured American forces composed of 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 39 PT boats. As soon as the Japanese fleet moved north almost single file, they were harassed and attacked from every angle by speedy American PT boats and more lethal torpedo-launching destroyers. The results were devastating for the Japanese. One large Japanese capital ship after another was destroyed. Near the end of the battle, the American battleships and cruisers executed the naval maneuver known as crossing the T at the top of the strait. Crossing the T meant that the Japanese ships could only fire a few of their front guns at the Americans, while the American ships sailing across the top could deliver salvos as a full broadside, the entirety of their side guns firing 14 and 16-inch shells. Besides the strategic advantage crossing the T gave the American battleships featured superior fire control systems than the Japanese that enabled them to fire precisely and score direct hits on the Japanese ships 11 miles away. The results were devastating. The little left of the Japanese Southern Force could not attack the Leyte landings and retreated back to the west. The danger for the Americans and the security of their landings, however, was not over. Halsey's move north had left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, and thus the northern flank of the landing Americans as well. All that stood between the very large Japanese center force and the Leyte landings was a much smaller task force, composed of a total of 16 very slow, small escort carriers with only 28 airplanes apiece, and some lightly armed destroyers, and even smaller destroyer escorts. The call sign for the tiny force was designated Taffy. Coming against Taffy was the massive Japanese center force composed of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. What happened next was one of the boldest and significant endeavors by the entire U.S. Navy during the course of the Second World War. Knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned, the Taffy Task Force boldly attacked the Japanese fleet. The lightly armored and lightly armed ships plunged into the Japanese line, firing numerous torpedoes and generating as much fire as possible against the Japanese ships. The small American escort carriers launched every available plane they had with whatever weapon they had attached. The Japanese fleet was inundated with endless attacks by air, and its admiral was convinced he was facing Halsey's much larger carriers of the Third Fleet. So ferocious were the attacks of the Taffy Task Force that the Japanese center force broke off its attack and retreated through the San Bernardino Strait. 3 of the Japanese battleships were no longer judged to be even battle-worthy. Thus, the tiny Taffy group held off a much larger Japanese fleet that could have destroyed the American landings at Leyte. Halsey's Third Fleet now, with its mainline carriers, moved against the decoy northern force and brought about its destruction. Halsey had received multiple calls from the 7th Fleet south to come and assist, but Halsey stubbornly refused to give up the chase of the Northern Fleet. Halsey's air squadrons flew over 500 sorties against the Japanese Northern Fleet. Any attempts by the Japanese squadrons to defend their fleet were ineffective, as were their attempts to strike the American fleet. The small converted carriers present in the Northern Fleet made easy targets for the Americans, and they succeeded in rendering several direct hits. Most notably, the light carrier, Zukaku, was sunk, which was the last carrier that participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor to be destroyed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was devastating for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan suffered over 12,000 casualties and lost 28 of its 67 participating ships. The Americans suffered 3,000 casualties and lost 7 of its 300 participating ships. The Japanese Navy could not suffer such losses. They would never again be able to amass such a large fleet again against American forces. Japan was running out of fuel for its navy, and after Leyte Gulf, some of Japan's best ships would be confined to port due to lack of fuel and supplies to set sail. Moreover, the Battle of Leyte Gulf also foreshadowed what was to come, as the desperate Japanese resorted to suicide flights, or kamikaze attacks, for the first time during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. After the battle, the Americans were the undoubted masters of the seas, and could begin to move almost at will without a large Japanese fleet to stop them. Of most immediate importance, the Allied landings at Leyte had not been thwarted, were able to continue, and commence the liberation of the Philippines. Now that the seas were secured around the Philippines, the Americans were able to concentrate on the large ground campaign that was required to liberate the islands. The landings were a success at Leyte, and now the Allies, composed of Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, and Filipinos, were able to fulfill MacArthur's promise to return. On October 20th, 1944, the iconic general fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines and came ashore at Leyte, walking down the ramp of a landing craft into the surf and onto the shore. The picture became one of the most famous of World War II and a symbol of American determination to liberate conquered peoples. The Americans conducted an additional series of amphibious landings to secure the largest islands in the Philippines, including Samar, Panay, Mindoro, and the large island of Luzon. At every step of the way, the primarily American and Australian forces were aided by Filipino guerrilla fighters who served as spies, scouts, saboteurs, assassins, and provided intelligence for the liberating Allies. Often, large sections of an island would already be under the control of Filipino partisans who had not stopped fighting ever since the Japanese arrived 3 years earlier. With almost non-existent air support or naval support offshore, many Japanese units were easily overrun and large sections of territory taken quickly. Fighting was more intense in the capital city of Manila. Japanese regular troops often refused to retreat and refused to surrender, and thus often had to be driven out of one building at a time. Heavy fighting occurred street to street and block to block. Large sections of the historic city were decimated by gunfire and shelling. As the Japanese were beaten back, numerous massacres were committed against Filipino residents of Manila, with old men, women, and children executed for no reason. The Battle of Manila would result in the deaths of 100,000 Filipinos, and Manila being transformed into one of the most devastated cities of the Second World War. Besides Filipino civilians who were liberated with the American advance, the survivors of the Batan Death March were finally freed from their POW camps. The survivors had been confined to Japanese prisoner of war camps for the duration of the war, where they experienced terrible hunger, dehydration, abuse, and punishment. Most of the survivors were terribly malnourished and near the brink of death. The Batan Death March in the Pacific Theater most closely approached some of the deliberate killing that occurred in the European theater during World War II. It would also lead to several high-profile war crime trials after the war. With the liberation of the Philippines by MacArthur's army forces and the success of Nimitz island-hopping campaign coming from the southeast, the two fronts converged closer and closer to mainland Japan. The Navy and Marines conducted additional operations in the Caroline and Mariana Islands. Truk Atoll served as a forward operating base for the Japanese combined fleet until a U.S. bombing and naval bombardment destroyed the port and facilities in February of 1944. After the landings conducted on Saipan in June 1944, additional Marines took Tinian and Guam the following month. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam all provided Americans with airfields large enough to launch B-29s on bombing runs against the home islands of Japan. More Marines landed at Palau and took the island of Peleliu in September of 1944. Still more took Ulithi Atoll as well in September of 1944 to serve as a large forward operating base for the United States Pacific Fleet. The United States was now well poised to overwhelm mainland Japan with aerial bombardment, and did so with more B-29s being sent against the mainland. However, the flight from the Marianas to Japan was long, and there was no place to land in the event of an emergency on the round trip. Moreover, the B-29s were often targeted heavily by anti-aircraft fire over Japan, suffering significant damage and making it risky if the bombers could make it all the way back to the Marianas. American pilots also came to realize that on their flights to Japan, the element of surprise was taken away due to a radar and radio unit operating on the small island of Iwo Jima, halfway between the Marianas and Japan. The early alerts being broadcasted from Iwo Jima gave fighters on the mainland time to scramble and attack the incoming B-29s. Losses among bomber crews began to mount, and so did calls to take the island of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is one of the many volcanic islands that lie dormant off the southeast coast of Japan. The 8-square-mile remains of a volcano are almost completely flat and featureless, except for the very prominent Mount Suribachi on the southern tip of the island, which rises almost instantly from the beach to a height of almost 600 feet. As the remains of a former volcano, the sands of Iwo Jima are coarse and black. Shrubbery and grasses cover much of the island. For centuries, a small civilian population lived on Iwo Jima, mostly as traders and fishermen. As the Americans moved closer to Japan, the Japanese military forcibly evacuated all of these residents and converted the entire island into a fortress and constructed an airfield to attack the oncoming Americans. The island was filled with machine gun nests, bunkers, foxholes, artillery positions, and large gun emplacements on the mountain. Mines and other booby traps made the small island into some of the toughest terrain to take during the Pacific War. Japanese made extensive use of Iwo Jima's natural caves and added tunnels to them, providing the defenders with 11 miles of tunnels to move below the surface and continue their resistance. 21,000 Japanese troops were stationed and ready to defend the island. Iwo Jima was some of the toughest terrain U.S. Marines faced during the entire Pacific War. For 9 months, bomber crews and naval guns blasted away at Iwo Jima. More ordnance was dropped and fired against Iwo Jima than any other target during the Pacific War. American invasion planners were certain there could be little left of the defenders of Iwo Jima. The American plan of attack would be initiated by a heavy naval bombardment for several days, followed by the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions landing on the southeast side of the island. The Marines hoped to easily move onto the airfields and take them, and then spend about 2 weeks securing the remainder of the island. No one anticipated it being that difficult. Despite the request of the Marines for the Navy to conduct 10 full days of naval bombardment against Iwo Jima, the Navy only agreed to a limited shelling for 3 days. The island was divided into thirds, and battleships such as the New York trained its 14-inch guns on the island and fired away for sometimes 6 straight hours. Witnessing the bombardment of the island, one Marine believed the entire island would sink into the ocean. So much ordnance had been detonated upon it. 450 ships awaited off the coast of Iwo Jima, and tens of thousands of Marines waited the signal to move ashore. The morning of February 19th was clear and sunny. Marines descended their rope ladders and entered their landing craft as they made their way to the landing beaches. The first group landed and hit the beach at about 9 a.m. in the morning. Invasion planners had completely misinformed the Marines regarding the conditions they would face as they landed on the sands of Iwo Jima. Boots sank right into the volcanic sand, and vehicles quickly got stuck. A 15-foot-high bluff immediately obstructed the ability of the Marines to quickly get off the beach. The slow trudge through the sands backed everything up on the beaches. More and more landing craft created a traffic jam, and crowds of Marines bunched together, making them feel increasingly vulnerable. Strangest of all, however, was the eerie silence. Few weapons were being fired against the oncoming Americans. Many Marines began to wonder if the landing would be the easy success they had been told. Progress was slow, but no defenders could even be found. The silence was part of the Japanese commander's plan. He intended to let the invaders pile up on the beaches, creating a concentrated target. He waited about an hour until he believed the beaches were sufficiently crowded, and then gave the order for his units to open fire. Suddenly, the beaches of Iwo Jima became a scene of unmatched death and carnage. Large guns from Mount Suribachi, artillery positions from the north side of the island, and machine gun nests from all over all combined their fire on the beaches below. Marines were blasted off the dark sands of Iwo Jima. Men were cut in half by the withering fire. Heads, legs, arms, torsos were flying around in the air. Everything was fire, smoke, explosions, and bullets. Fallen bodies covered the ground. There was no cover on the wide-open sands to be found. One newspaper correspondent who came ashore with the Marines called the scene a nightmare in hell. Entire platoons were wiped out. It was unclear who was in charge as officer after officer fell or disappeared after a mortar blast. The Marines endeavored to dig with their hands into the sands to get as low as possible and avoid the universal field of fire. One of those killed on the first day of fighting was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, a hero of Guadalcanal and Medal of Honor recipient. After his heroics on Guadalcanal, Basilone was reassigned to the States to join a war bonds tour. But boredom set in, and Basilone was resolved to be fighting alongside his fellow Marines. Returning to active duty, Basilone trained machine gunners and landed on the first day at Iwo Jima. Basilone destroyed a blockhouse that was pinning down his men on the beach, and then moved towards one of the airfields. Basilone destroyed a blockhouse that was pinning down his men on the beach, and then moved towards one of the airfields. Basilone was struck by machine gun fire and died instantly. Basilone was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his valor and bravery on Iwo Jima. The Marines struggled mightily to get off the beaches, over the bluff, and take some ground inland. Every little patch of grass was another buried machine gun nest. Every little knoll concealed a mortar unit. Mines and tripwires were everywhere. Bomb craters did more to provide foxholes for the defenders than assist the attackers. Large guns continued to rain down fire from on top of Mount Suribachi. Progress was slow, and usually not made until armored vehicles made it onto the island or flamethrower crews could lead the way. Some Marines did not manage to get off the beaches until bulldozers landed and plowed a hole right through the large bluff. By the end of the first day, 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima, and very few planned objectives were reached, although one detachment of Marines were able to cut off Mount Suribachi from the rest of the island's defenders. The Marines had weeks ahead of them to subdue every inch of Iwo Jima. Marine battalions took heavy casualty rates as hardly any of the Japanese were willing to surrender. Armored vehicles with flamethrowers were particularly effective in rooting out concealed Japanese, and eventually the twin airstrips of the island were secured. The fight to take Iwo Jima was vastly different on the southern end of the island compared to the north. The northern end of the island was seemingly level, but concealed a command post that was buried 90 feet below ground. Caves and tunnels provided the buried command center with months of rations, purified water, and fuel. It was an enormous task to subdue the tunnel complex. 4 tons of explosives were dropped into the tunnel complex to kill its remaining inhabitants and collapse the structure. Even then, 300 Japanese managed to conduct a suicidal banzai charge out of the tunnels against unsuspecting Americans. For weeks ahead, the Americans would still be rooting out concealed Japanese in the tunnel complexes of Iwo Jima. Incredibly, the last 2 Japanese defenders surrendered 4 years after the war was over, emerging, like so many others, from out of the tunnels of the island. Marine platoons had to move carefully but doggedly in the south to scale the heights of Mount Suribachi and take the peak. Even after taking the peak, however, an endless series of caves and tunnels meant thousands of Japanese soldiers lurked inside of the mountain. It would take weeks to eliminate them all, or for them to die isolated by hunger and dehydration. On the 4th day of the invasion, Marines had taken the top of Mount Suribachi and wanted to encourage the battling units below by raising an American flag on the mountain's peak. A small American flag was at first raised, but it was too difficult to see. A larger American flag was found and rushed to the top of Mount Suribachi. The replacement flag was tied to a piece of Japanese water pipe, and 6 members of E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines Regiment, 5th Marines Division raised the flag together on top of Mount Suribachi. An Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal was on the summit of Suribachi to witness the flag raising and quickly turned to see the flag going up and snapped the most famous photo of World War II, possibly the most famous photo in history. The black and white shot of raising the flag on Iwo Jima would be featured in newspapers and magazines all across the nation and around the world. The photo represented the determination and fighting spirit of the Americans as they were the first to plant a foreign flag on Imperial Japanese homeland. Tragically, 3 of the Marines depicted in the photograph would be killed in combat a few days later on Iwo Jima. American losses were unexpected and staggeringly high at Iwo Jima. There were 26,000 American casualties, of which 6,800 were the dead from a 5-week-long campaign. The Japanese suffered over 20,000 casualties, of which approximately 18,000 were deaths. The cost of taking Iwo Jima would be extensively debated for years to come, but the victory of the American Marines on the tiny island became a defining event for the Marine Corps and for the United States during the Second World War. American forces had now moved so closely to mainland Japan that their B-29s were regularly bombing the islands, and the next main objective would be to conduct an invasion of the home islands of Japan. In preparation for this massive undertaking, Army and Marine planners settled on the necessity of taking the island of Okinawa in the extreme south of Japan in order to use the island as anchorage for the fleet and a jumping-off point for the impending invasion of Japan. Even though the taking of Okinawa was supposed to support the last battle of the war, unexpectedly, the Battle of Okinawa became the last battle of the war. Okinawa is one of the main islands that compose the Ryukyu Islands on the extreme southern portion of the Japanese homeland. There is dense growth on top of a very rocky, uneven surface that features mountains, ridges, hills, valleys, gullies, and a seemingly endless system of caves and tunnels. The operation to invade Okinawa was the largest single operation in the Pacific War. The naval fleet was double that of the invasion of Normandy the previous year. 600,000 American troops would go up against 76,000 Japanese and 40,000 conscripted Okinawans on the island. American casualties would become the highest of the war and sicken Americans on the home front on the idea of more combat to come and taking more losses. The American plan to take the island involved a massive preliminary naval bombardment, followed by numerous Army and Marine divisions fighting across the island. The northern portions of the island turned out to be easier to take than the southern sectors. The Japanese defenders made effective use of one natural ridgeline after another in the south and their caves. An elaborate tunnel system also connected the caves, as they did on Iwo Jima. With one ascending ridgeline after another defending the line in front of it, the Americans had to go inch by inch and corner by corner to take every little bit of the southern defenses. The Japanese allowed the American troops to land as they desired to draw in the American fleet close to the island and give them a sense of security. As usual, the Navy began to pummel Okinawa with rockets, bombs, and shelling to soften up the defenses for the landing troops. While the Navy was thus engaged, however, the Japanese let loose with a new and desperate strategy that yielded devastating results. The Kamikazes were Japanese suicide pilots who had loaded down their planes with as much fuel and ordnance as possible and then deliberately crashed them into American ships. The word kamikaze means divine wind, and invoked a timely 13th century typhoon that destroyed a fleet of Mongol invaders that were attacking Japan. The kamikaze pilots were often young and inexperienced pilots who only knew enough how to take off, steer, and direct their planes towards their targets. All American sailors could do was fire as much anti-aircraft flak as possible while the kamikazes continued their flights. American sailors were horrified by the tenacity of the Japanese pilots and their willingness to sacrifice their lives for a lost cause. Over 2,000 kamikaze attacks launched. Only 1 in 10 strikes hit their targets. 1,000 Japanese pilots were killed in the attacks. The direct hits of the kamikazes sank 36 American ships and damaged 300 others. Almost 5,000 U.S. crewmen were killed in the kamikaze attacks, and for the first time in a battle with the Japanese, more Navy personnel than Army or Marines were killed. Amidst the brutal fighting on Okinawa, Americans were shocked to hear that their leader was dead. Franklin Roosevelt, whose health had been rapidly declining, suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945. For many Americans, they had never known a different president than FDR. They considered him the one who had pulled the nation out of the Great Depression and was tragically stricken even as the nation approached victory in World War II. A large funeral procession was held in Washington, and then FDR's body was transported to Hyde Park, New York, his home, to be buried. The nation witnessed the swearing in of a new president on April 12, 1945. That evening, the Vice President of the United States, Harry Truman, was sworn in as president in the cabinet room of the White House. Truman, a former senator from Missouri, felt woefully unprepared for the task ahead. During the roughly 100 days that he had served as FDR's vice president, Truman had only met with the president twice. He had not been briefed on war operations or secret projects. The new president had to be quickly brought up to speed regarding war plans and secret projects. The fighting raged across Okinawa with an unprecedented ferocity. Both sides took heavy casualties as they struggled over the terrain. 60 miles of interconnected tunnels and caves and bunkers made Okinawa a veritable fortress for the Japanese defenders, and the Americans had to move position by position and blast out the Japanese with satchel charges, grenades, mortars, naval shelling, heavy artillery, and especially flamethrowers. Indeed, American troops found flamethrowers particularly effective on Okinawa, as it seemed they were the only weapon that the Japanese were afraid of. The ridgelines and uneven terrain on the southern portion of the island continued to provide one challenge after another for the Americans to overcome. Every shrub, tree, or bush seemed to conceal yet another cave or tunnel entrance in which Japanese soldiers were hiding and picking off Americans. One ridgeline after another prevented anything resembling a rapid advance by the Americans across the island. One of the most formidable landforms the Americans encountered was the Maeda Escarpment. The escarpment was hundreds of feet high at sections and was a face of solid limestone jutting out of the flat terrain below. American forces were forced to root out the Japanese in and around the cliffs, with some scaling directly the flat surface of the ledge. Once American forces reached the top of the escarpment, they fell under a withering barrage of Japanese mortar and artillery fire. Intense man-to-man and hand-to-hand combat took place on top of the ledge. Hundreds of Americans fell wounded, dying and dead. Those that fought there referred to the escarpment as Hacksaw Ridge, because so many men were cut down as with a great saw. At this moment, an unlikely hero stepped forward to rescue multiple American lives while placing himself in great jeopardy. Army Corporal Desmond Doss was a devout Christian and firm pacifist who believed killing, even in time of warfare, was morally wrong. He enlisted in the army as a conscientious objector and therefore was not required to carry a weapon. Doss was a combat medic, and, despite suffering his own wounds around the escarpment, he tended to the dying and wounded on top of the ledge. Incredibly, Doss worked almost single-handedly to get wounded men off the top of the ridge. He tied a rope to a stretcher and then loaded the wounded into the stretcher. Almost single-handedly, Doss used the rope to lower the filled stretcher to additional combat medics waiting below so that the wounded could be evacuated from the killing zone on top of the ridge. Corporal Desmond Doss personally evacuated upwards of 70 wounded soldiers from the heights of the Maeda Escarpment, and as a result no doubt saved many of their lives. Doss, too, was injured, seeing additional action on Okinawa. For his courage and valor above the call of duty, Desmond Doss would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor presented to him by President Truman himself. Doss was the only soldier of the entire Second World War who won the Medal of Honor as a conscientious objector. While the troops struggled across Okinawa, they received word that the war in Europe was over and that VE Day was being celebrated. Although a victory for the nation, the troops in the Pacific had to move forward knowing that the war in their theater was not yet over, and that death was still a constant companion. The rainy season turned Okinawa into a bog of mud that made Okinawa look like a World War I battlefield. Everywhere there was debris, wreckage, dead bodies, and slaughtered animals that sank in the mud. Everything was cold and wet and miserable. The Japanese were so desperate for more troops to defend Okinawa that they resorted to drafting children into the armed forces to attack the Americans. The children were quickly indoctrinated and then often sent against American tanks in suicide attacks that resulted in the death of the children. School children and female nurses were recruited as combatants, firing rifles or carrying explosives. Villagers were forced to wear explosive vests, and enter the ranks of the Americans. Almost 2,000 Okinawan children were recruited in such a manner, and about half of them were killed in battle. The Battle of Okinawa brought the war home to Japanese civilians in a new and real way. Okinawans were forced to defend the island even though they had been victims of racial discrimination by the Japanese for years. Approximately 150,000 Okinawans were killed, committed suicide, or went missing during the 3-month conflict. That is roughly half of the pre-invasion Okinawan population. This famous image is from a video of a cold, hungry, and dirty child who was rescued by Marines, and really brought home to American audiences the reality of the suffering civilians and what they were experiencing on the war front. Among the casualties on Okinawa was famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle. Pyle had written extensively for American papers during the war, and in powerful prose had described the war and the experience of GIs for audiences at home. He earned the respect of many GIs as well for his willingness to live among the troops and experience the same conditions they were undergoing. Ernie Pyle was killed by a Japanese machine gun, however, during the Okinawan campaign on April 18, 1945. During the 83 days of fighting on Okinawa, approximately 14,000 Americans were killed in action and 40 to 55,000 wounded. The Japanese lost 75,000 to 110,000 personnel. The appalling number of casualties for the island sent a grim message to the Americans that the closer they got to mainland Japan, the more intensely the Japanese would fight and the more Americans would die. Nothing was going to get easier. Perhaps the greatest significance of the Battle of Okinawa was that it brought home that grim reality of how high the casualties could become in the event of an American invasion of the Japanese homeland. American strategists had been planning for an invasion of the main islands of Japan for months. The Joint Chiefs speculated that it would take over 1 million American casualties in order to take the home islands. Some thought the number would be higher, perhaps 2 million. It was unclear just how many casualties the American public would accept, particularly with one theater of war completed and won. The Japanese War Cabinet was fully anticipating a massive invasion by the Americans, but they still refused to surrender. In fact, the Japanese High Command began to speak to the public of the necessity of a 1 million-person suicide as necessary to beat back the American invasion and refuse to surrender. The new president, Harry Truman, and many Americans, particularly the troops doing the fighting, were desperate for an alternative answer. Now that the American B-29s had virtually no resistance in their bombing runs against Japan, the Army air squadrons let loose with unprecedented terror from the air. Bombers taking off from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam could strike at will against targets virtually anywhere in Japan. Harbors, factories, fields, and entire cities were flattened by the destruction. The entire economy of Japan was virtually ruined and inoperable. Hunger was a growing source of desperation. In the largest air raid in history, the bombers conducted Operation Meeting House against Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. Over 300 bombers flew from Saipan and Guam to Tokyo and let loose with the greatest torrent of destruction of the entire war. Not just conventional bombs, but incendiaries or napalm was dropped on Tokyo to ensure the entire city was consumed by fire. The incendiaries exploded at 2,000 feet and spread their napalm clusters onto the wooden and paper structures below. The city became an ocean of fire. Temperatures shot up to several thousand degrees. All the oxygen was sucked out of the air. Cyclones of fiery wind rushed through the streets of the city. Much of what was left was just ash. Approximately 100,000 people were killed in Operation Meeting House, and an estimated 1 million people became displaced refugees. Despite the destruction of their capital, the Japanese War Cabinet still refused to surrender, and were still resolved to go down fighting on behalf of their divine emperor. More cities were targeted, more bombers were sent, and hundreds of thousands more were incinerated, but still the cabinet refused to surrender. Shortly after being sworn in as president, Harry Truman was informed of a secret Army project to construct a superweapon which would be able to destroy an entire city with a single bomb. The Manhattan Project was a joint U.S. Army and civilian engineering project that would usher the world into the atomic age and end the largest of wars with the largest of weapons. The Manhattan Project was the product of research facilities from over 30 sites scattered around the United States. Some of the most important uranium enrichment occurred at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the project was eventually headquartered and tested at Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico. Over 130,000 researchers and developers were involved with the project, mostly in the United States, but also in Canada and the United Kingdom. The project would cost $2 billion, which is equivalent to $23 billion today. The Calitron girls were young women who monitored Calitron control panels during the course of the project. Gladys Owens, seated in the foreground of this picture, was unaware of what she had been involved with until seeing this photo on a public tour of the facility 50 years later. The national coordinator of the Manhattan Project was Army General Leslie Groves. Groves was known as a stickler for detail and a meticulous taskmaster who was determined to see to the success of the project. Groves had also earlier overseen the design and construction of the Pentagon building, which would become the headquarters for the Department of Defense after the war. The chief scientist in charge of the project and the director of the Los Alamos Lab was the brilliant University of California physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was the son of Jewish immigrants and grew up in New York City. He enrolled at Harvard University as a chemistry major, but also began to study physics. Oppenheimer went on to study physics at Cambridge University in England and earned his PhD in 1927 at the age of 23. Earning a fellowship at the University of California, he became a professor of physics and published several significant papers regarding quantum and nuclear physics in the 1920s and 1930s. Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project researchers were particularly interested in the possibilities of nuclear energy and how the power of the atom could be released in a single blast in bomb form. Early designs experimented with a gun-type fission method in which one particle would be fired at another through essentially a gun barrel, and an implosion method in which a radioactive core would be compressed, releasing intense energy, the bomb blast. Both methods were developed simultaneously at labs around the country. There was initially great concern that one atomic reaction would lead to an infinite series of chain reactions, and the entire atmosphere would be exploded by the project. Eventually confident that the reaction could be measured and controlled, the Manhattan Project researchers were ready to test their superweapon in the summer of 1945. Drama and suspense seemed to fill the air and the staff of those that worked at Los Alamos Labs, as many could sense the project was coming to a climax and something was about to happen. A remote location in the New Mexico desert was chosen to perform the test. A 100-foot-high steel tower was constructed from the top of which the device, codename Gadget, could be dropped. The surrounding area was cleared, and a little over 400 personnel were permitted to witness the test, including Oppenheimer. The device was hoisted to the top of the tower in early July, and then the test was to be conducted when temperature and wind conditions were just right. Those conditions were judged to be acceptable early on the morning of July 16, 1945. Detonation occurred at 5:29 a.m. With a massive flash of bright light, the Gadget erupted into a massive fireball that churned in upon itself as it went higher and higher into the sky. The darkness of the morning was suddenly light. The fireball ascended hundreds of feet into the air. The surrounding mountains were illuminated. The very ground seemed to flee from the center of the blast. Onlookers immediately felt the intense burst of heat, even though they were 20 miles away. Everyone who witnessed the blast realized humanity had entered a new era, the age of nuclear weapons. Some laughed, some cried, most remained silent. Witnessing the fruits of his creation, Oppenheimer considered a verse from the Hindu sacred book Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. President Truman, who was attending the Potsdam Conference with other world leaders on what was now defeated German territory, was passed a note during the conference that read, "The baby is born." Instantly, the president knew what the message meant. He endorsed the use of the weapon against a Japanese city as the military deemed useful. Components for both types of bombs were delivered unassembled by aircraft and ships to the island of Tinian in the Pacific. A special composite air wing was created that would be tasked with assembling the devices and then delivering them to their targets. The USS Indianapolis was selected for the top-secret mission to deliver the uranium and other bomb components to Tinian. The Indianapolis completed its delivery to Tinian and then departed for the Philippines. At 12:15 a.m. on July 30th, 4 days after making its delivery, Indianapolis was struck on her starboard side by 2 torpedoes, one in the bow and one amidship, from a Japanese submarine. 12 minutes later, the Indianapolis rolled completely over, then her stern rose into the air and she plunged down. Some 300 of the 1,195 crewmen aboard went down with the ship. With few lifeboats and many without life jackets, the remainder of the crew was set adrift. Approximately 900 men were set adrift in the water by the sinking. Many of the survivors were injured, and others suffered from lack of food and water, dehydration, exposure, and hypothermia. The sinking of Indianapolis resulted in the most shark attacks in human history. Several dozen or up to 300 sailors were probably killed by sharks. Only 316 of the nearly 900 men set adrift after the sinking of the Indianapolis survived the disaster. Several urban targets were considered for the bomb dropping. Tokyo was ruled out, as much of it had been destroyed by Operation Meeting House. Many Japanese cities had already experienced high levels of damage due to B-29 raids. But Hiroshima, on Japan's large island of Honshu, had not been as targeted as others and was still functioning as an important military and industrial urban area. After the Japanese government had once again ignored an additional ultimatum issued by the Allies to surrender unconditionally, the decision to use the bomb was made immediately. Little Boy, the code name for the enriched uranium gun-type fission weapon, was to be used first and was loaded onto a specially fitted B-29 on Tinian Island. The name of the B-29 was the Enola Gay. It was the name of the lead pilot's mother, Colonel Paul Tibbets. The crew of the Enola Gay would not only be composed of standard crewmen, but also engineers who could assemble and prep the bomb before its drop over a designated target. After leaving Tinian, the Enola Gay flew to Iwo Jima to rendezvous with accompanying aircraft. As Hiroshima is 2,000 miles away from Tinian, the flight to the target took 6 hours. The Enola Gay arrived over the target in clear visibility at 31,000 feet. The safety devices were removed 30 minutes before reaching the target area. The Enola Gay targeted the Aoi Bridge in Hiroshima as a convenient target site, but due to some crosswinds, the bomb missed the aiming point by about 800 feet and detonated directly over the Shima Surgical Clinic. The bomb was dropped at 31,000 feet and took 44 seconds to drop before it detonated. The Enola Gay flew an additional 11.5 miles before it felt the blast. The bomb detonated at almost 2,000 feet above the city to achieve a maximum bomb blast radius. Little Boy detonated at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945. Approximately 141 pounds of uranium-235 exploded, releasing the equivalent of 16 kilotons of TNT. The weapon was considered very inefficient, with only 1.7% of its material fissioning. The radius of total destruction was about 1 mile, with resulting fires across 4.5 square miles. A fiery mushroom cloud ascended nearly 1,000 feet in the air. In a blinding flash, Hiroshima was leveled. Entire blocks of the city were incinerated or flattened by the blast. Fires raged everywhere, and the very air seemed to be absent of oxygen. Approximately 5 square miles of the city were completely destroyed. Some 70 to 80,000 people, around 30% of the population of Hiroshima at the time, were killed instantly by the blast and the resultant firestorm. Another 70,000 were injured. It is estimated that as many as 20,000 Japanese military personnel were killed. Eventually, a total of approximately 125,000 people died as a result of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Those that survived, but yet were still close enough to the blast radius, suffered horrible second and third-degree burns and blisters over a large percentage of their bodies. Some literally had their eyes or entire faces melted away. Mothers and children were fused together due to the heat of the blast. The burns formed painful blisters all over the backs of numerous victims. So great was the intense flash of the bomb that some suffered flash burns simply being exposed to the flash. Some victims suffered the effects of radiation poisoning for weeks or months after the blast. Birth defects and a multitude of cancers would be reported in higher numbers in Hiroshima in the years to come. One of the more shocking effects of the blast was the presence of flash burn shadows imprinted on brick and concrete, cast by the brilliantly bright flash of the bomb. So great was the bright flash of the bomb that objects caught in the flash could have their shadow burned onto a nearby surface. Where once stood a person with a cane, now all that remained was the permanently imprinted shadow of that person on some nearby steps. Even after becoming aware of the destruction at Hiroshima from the atomic bomb, the Japanese War Council once again convened and once again refused to surrender to the Allies. Many in the War Council believed the Americans only had one nuclear bomb, and now that they had weathered the attack, their resistance could continue. Strategic Bomber Command, although surprised that the Japanese still refused to surrender, resolved to drop another device on Japan to fulfill President Truman's warning of a, quote, rain of ruin, unquote, from the air, if Japan continued to refuse to surrender. Another squadron of B-29s was tasked with dropping a second bomb on a second Japanese city. The B-29 this time delivering the weapon was nicknamed Boxcar and piloted by Charles W. Sweeney. The second bomb, this time nicknamed Fat Man, was an implosion-type nuclear weapon in which conventional external explosives would collapse the plutonium core, releasing the blast. The task force of B-29s once again took off from Tinian Island early on the morning of August 9, 1945. The Japanese city of Kokura was the primary target of Boxcar, but by the time the plane arrived over the city, the target was obscured by fog and drifting smoke. Sweeney and his crew decided to proceed to the secondary target of Nagasaki. The city of Nagasaki was an important port city and industrial center where much of Japan's war munitions had been produced. Nagasaki had not experienced much bombing due to its surrounding mountains, making it difficult to target with the radar systems of the time. At about 11 a.m. on August 9th, the crew of Boxcar arrived over the city of Nagasaki. A last-second clearing of clouds gave visual confirmation to the bombardier, and the decision was made to release the weapon. Fat Man, containing a core of 11 pounds of plutonium, was dropped over Nagasaki and exploded at 11:02 a.m. Japan time. The bomb detonated approximately 1,600 feet directly above a tennis court and immediately vaporized much of the city. The kiloton blast of Fat Man was greater than that of Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima, but the destruction was contained as Nagasaki was a coastal city surrounded by mountains, which in effect acted as a blast shield for the bomb radius. Nevertheless, the destruction of Nagasaki was thorough, with over 1 square mile becoming utter destruction. Less than a second after the detonation, the north of the city was destroyed and 35,000 people were instantly killed. Makeshift hospitals were constructed to tend to the wounded survivors, although many of the city's doctors had been killed in the blast. Survivors desperately sought water to quench their thirst or to cool their burns, but the atomic blast evaporated most water sources immediately into steam. The Nagasaki Prefecture report on the bombing characterized Nagasaki as, quote, like a graveyard with not a tombstone standing, unquote. A total of 80,000 people would eventually die as a result of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. As at Hiroshima, survivors would struggle with radiation sickness and increased cancer rates in the decades to come. Despite the incredible destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were still members of the Imperial Japanese War Council that refused to surrender and vowed to continue the war. After an extensive meeting on August 9th, the War Council became deadlocked on what to do next. In the end, it was the Japanese Emperor Hirohito who interceded and made the decision to accept the Allied ultimatum of unconditional surrender. In a stunning moment for common Japanese citizens, for the first time, they heard the voice of their revered divine emperor. On August 14, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcasted his official capitulation message to his people, known as the Imperial Rescript on the termination of the war. In his capitulation message to the nation, the emperor never uses the word surrender, but he does announce Japan's willingness to accept the Allied ultimatum. He also referenced the new weapons the Americans were using against Japan and that, in order to save civilization, Japan must submit to avoid total destruction. The formal surrender of Japan took place on September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri. The Japanese foreign minister and a Japanese general officially signed for the nation of Japan. General MacArthur signed for the U.S. Army, and Admiral Nimitz for the naval forces of the United States. Representatives for the Chinese, British, French, and Soviets also signed the instrument of surrender. Celebrations broke out worldwide upon the announcement from Hirohito that Japan was surrendering. Thousands poured into Times Square in New York City and expressed exuberant joy that at last the Second World War had come to an end. Many famous photographs were taken on VJ Day, but this is probably the most famous. VJ Day in Times Square is a photograph taken by Alfred Eisenstadt and was published in Life magazine in 1945 with the caption, "In New York's Times Square, a white-clad girl clutches her purse and skirt as an uninhibited sailor plants his lips squarely on hers." The girl was later identified as Greta Zimmer Friedman, an Austrian-born American dental assistant. Although in the coming years many American sailors would claim to be the kissing sailor in the famous photo, the kisser is usually identified as George Mendonça, a sailor from Rhode Island on leave from the USS The Sullivans. VJ Day in Times Square has become one of the most famous and most iconic photographs from World War II and the 20th century. The Japanese surrender, however, was not a source of joy for everyone. Many Japanese soldiers stationed at remote locations throughout the Pacific either did not hear or refused to believe for some time to come that their emperor had surrendered to the Allies. They continued to fight and hold their position for weeks or months or even years to come. Hiroo Onoda was one of the most famous holdouts in the Philippines. He refused to abandon his position until, in 1974, his commanding officer, who had been retired for many years and living in Japan, personally traveled to the Philippines and relieved Onoda of his position on orders of the emperor. Thus, the tenacity the Japanese demonstrated from the beginning of the war continued to the very end. Despite the holdouts, however, the hostilities of the war in the Pacific and the Second World War finally came to an end.